Welcome to Disciple Dojo. We're continuing our walk through the lyrics of the Psalms. In this episode, we're going to look at Psalm 15. As always, if you've missed previous episodes in this series, the playlist is going to be linked in the video description. So if you enjoy this episode, be sure to check out the others. So as usual, I'm going to read it in my old NIV translation, and then we're going to look at the Hebrew text and we're going to compare different translations and see what we find. Psalm 15, a Psalm of David. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy hill? He whose walk is blameless, and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart, and has no slander on his tongue, who does his neighbor no wrong, and casts no slur on his fellow man, who despises a vile man, but honors those who fear the Lord, who keeps his oath even when it hurts, who lends his money without usury, and does not accept a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. So it begins, Mizmor le David, a song to David, a song for David, a Davidic song, we could say. And so it starts, Yahweh, that's the name of the Lord right there, Yahweh, who will sojourn, Yagur. This means to dwell. This is the term that's used for Abraham sojourning in the land of Canaan. It means to live somewhere that's not where you're from, you could say. Ba'ahaleka, in your tent. Now, this gets translated in NIV, in your sanctuary. But that's overly churchy. This is the word for tent. And yes, the tabernacle did become the sanctuary, but in English, sanctuary just brings up this kind of churchy architectural term. This is literally just the word for tent. Yahweh, who will sojourn in your tent? And then next line, Mi Yishkon, who will dwell Bahar Kadasheka, on your holy mountain. So why does this say who will dwell on your holy mountain? Well, we have a video here back a couple of years ago in our Backgrounds of Sinai series. We talked about the concept of the mountain of God and the tabernacle, the temple, Eden itself being thought of as a mountain or God's holy mountain. And that's where the imagery of Mount Zion comes from. Even though if you go to Jerusalem, Zion's not actually a mountain. You know, there's a hill. The temple was built on the Temple Mount, but it's not a mountain. But the idea theologically, the image, the biblical image of dwelling on the mountain of God, that's a concept that was known not just in Israel, but throughout the ancient world. Gods were thought to dwell in their tents on their mountain. Now, here's a great footnote I found in a commentary that I want to share just because it's kind of funny. But about this, like what type of psalm this is, Michael Wilcock in The Bible Speaks Today, he talks about, scholars classify this in what some would now call an opening act of worship. And others use, and this German term, Einzugliturgie. And the footnote, I have to click on this because it's hilarious. About that word, Einzugliturgie, it's literally entrance liturgy. And then he says, at only 15 letters, a relatively short example of the sort of technical German word that has been unkindly likened to a trunk falling downstairs. This is the most accurate footnote description of theological German that I think I've ever come across. And so he says this German word sounding like a trunk falling down the stairs, which all German does, an impressive word suitable for an awesome occasion. And that's the point of this is somebody this song is being sung as you're going to the temple. You are approaching the mountain of God, the tabernacle, the temple, Mount Zion. At whatever point in history this song is sung, it is describing entering into the presence of God Almighty himself. And so amid splendor and ritual, the worshipers arrive at the sanctuary, the tent, fully aware that this was no place for the casual and the shoddy. This is a solemn occasion. But Wilcock goes on to note, the NIV's translation of verse 1 as sanctuary misses a miracle. The word there rendered sanctuary simply means tent. God had first decreed the making of his tent at a time when everyone was living in tents. He proposed to do the same, to make his home among his people. The miraculous double resonance of that simple word is that it is both awesome, it was after all God's tent, and, in the British sense, homely. In fact, and quite designedly, a foreshadowing of the incarnation when the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. And that's literally how John 1:14 would be translated in Greek. And it's related to this verb right here, who will dwell, shekan, on the mountain of your holiness or your holy mountain. And so asking like who can sojourn or who can live? Some have even suggested who can camp in God's tent. This also brings to mind images of ancient Near East hospitality. When you would enter into the tent of someone, you entered into their company, their hospitality, their protection. And Craig Broyles picks up on that in his commentary in Understanding the Bible series. He says, its use here, the word tent, suits the notion of sojourning and echoes the ancient custom of the traveler who comes under the protection of the divine host, whose tent he has entered. So this psalm, this short little psalm, is sort of like a catechism. It's like a training for who can dwell in the tent of God, who can live, who can camp with God. This whole concept of sacred space, again, see our Sinai Backgrounds video playlist for that, about the mountain of God and sacred space and what the tabernacle symbolized, because there are layers and layers of meaning and imagery and symbolism packed into these few words in this 5-verse psalm. But to answer the question, the psalm goes on in verse 2. Okay, you want to know who can dwell, who can approach the God of Israel, Yahweh himself? Well, here's who. Verse 2, Holek Tamim, one walking, and I've just left this transliterated, Tamim. This word Tamim, it means complete, whole, integrity, maturity, not lacking anything, unblemished, blameless. These are all ways that this word gets translated throughout the Hebrew Bible, because there's really not a good one-to-one English equivalent for tamim. It's used of animals that can be sacrificed. They can't have blemishes, they can't have defects, they can't be lacking anything. But that's the first quality, one who is walking, and it's literally holek, walking, going about. In biblical Hebrew, the way you walk is the way you live. And then the next part, upoel tzedek, and one doing. This verb pa'al means to do, to perform, to practice, to tangibly enact, tzedek. And I've also left tzedek untranslated because it can mean righteousness. I mean, this is the word for righteous, upright, one who is doing tzedek, who's doing righteousness, not liking righteousness, not agreeing with righteousness, not wanting to do righteousness, but one who is actively doing righteousness. V'dober emeth bilvavo, and speaking truth in his heart. Not just saying truth with his words, but literally in his heart, in his inner being. Levav just means your heart, your mind, your inner self. At the core of who he is, he's someone who speaks truth. So these are the first 3 positive qualities that one who can dwell with the Lord should have. And different translations handle these terms differently. That's why I left them transliterated. But for instance, Lexham English, he who walks blamelessly and does what is right, he who speaks honestly in his heart. The Tanakh, he who lives without blame, who does what is right and in his heart acknowledges the truth. New American Standard, one who walks with integrity, practices righteousness, and speaks truth in his heart. The Holman Christian had the one who lives honestly, practices righteousness, and acknowledges the truth in his heart. And then when they updated to the CSB, they changed to the one who lives blamelessly. And I like Eugene Peterson, he gets right to the point. Walk straight, act right, tell the truth. That's actually not too far off. So this is the qualities of one who can dwell in the tent of God on his holy mountain. And not just doing these things, but now there's things that he doesn't do. Verse 3, Lo ragal al ushno. Literally, it's he does not, and this is the word ragal. It means slander or give a bad report, but it comes from the word foot. To go about on foot. And so in his commentary on the Psalms, Derek Kidner says the word for slander has a background of going around to spy things out or spread them abroad. Now, how far we want to press that, this is a figure of speech, this is an idiom, so you don't have to translate this as one who goes around spreading slander, but it's probably somewhere in that ballpark. The whole point is this is someone who, again, speaks truth in his heart, so that means he does not slander upon his tongue or by his tongue or with his tongue. And then the next line, you can kind of hear how this rhymes. Lo asa, lo ra'ehu, or ah. You can't bring poetic sound from one language into another, but it does flow a lot smoother in Hebrew. Literally, though, it says, and he does not make for his neighbor, re'ah, and then this is a play on that, ra'ah. He doesn't make for his neighbor, ra'ah, bad or evil. His tongue doesn't slander. He doesn't create bad for people around him. And then this next line, v'cherpa lo nasa al korovo. And Rolf Jacobson, in his commentary in Nikot, talking about cherpa, he says, our culture does not have a word that can adequately convey the power of cherpa, which is often translated as taunt or reproach. The Hebrew term is far weightier than that communicated by the English taunt or reproach. It carries a sense of social shame and rejection that is highly odious. To utter a cherpa against the neighbor is to compromise a person's participation in society and thus to rob one of access to the basic structures of communal life. So the person who can dwell on God's holy mountain in God's tent is someone who cherpa, this concept, this communal heaping of shame, cherpa, he does not lift over one near him. We would say over his neighbor, but it's not the word for neighbor. It's literally karvo, one drawing near to him. So Lexham English, he does not slander with his tongue. He does not harm his friend, nor bring up a disgrace against his neighbor. The Tanakh, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow or borne reproach for his acts towards his neighbor. New American, he does not slander with his tongue, nor do evil to his neighbor, nor bring shame on his friend. And then the CSB, who does not slander with his tongue, who does not harm his friend or discredit his neighbor. So backing up to verse 2 and reading all this as a whole, this should call to mind the Sermon on the Mount. You know, when Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And he uses the Greek word that is frequently used to translate this Hebrew word tamim. And I like how Jacobson says it in his commentary. He says the term tamim, translated integrity, literally means something like all-encompassing. And I like this way of thinking of tamim, all-encompassing. It suggests that a life lived in the Lord's sphere of influence is completely dominated and saturated by God's will. That's a great way to think about what tamim means, what Jesus meant when he talked about be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, what John Wesley referred to as Christian perfection. It was this biblical perfection means completely dedicated, devoted. I like this, dominated and saturated by God's will. And then commenting on tzedek, to perform tzedek is to match one's deeds to God's will. Now, verse 4 is tricky, and there's a difference between the Hebrew and the Greek translation here. In Hebrew, it literally says, nibze ba'enau nim'as. This is a participle, being despised, you would say. I just put despised, but it's one being despised. It's a passive participle. In his eyes, one being rejected, another participle. Now, the Masoretic text, if this is how it should be translated, what that would mean is the nimas is one who has been rejected, one who has been cut off, one who has been ostracized. It refers to evildoers who have been cut off from God, who have been, this is a communal context. And so those who disrupt, who commit injustice or evil, those who have been judged and cut off from the people of God, in the eyes of the one who can dwell with God, they also must be despised. So this would be like the concept of shunning, like one who is shunned by the community is despised in the eyes of this person. Now, the Septuagint translates this verse in Greek as he scorns before his face the one doing evil, but the one fearing the Lord he praises. So the Hebrew text is despised in his eyes is the one who has been rejected, the one who has been cast off. The Septuagint, despised in his eyes or before his face, is an evildoer. Either way, the meaning is about the same. It's this person. Not only do they treat others well, but they don't turn a blind eye to evil or tolerate communal destruction. But the ones fearing Yahweh, he honors or glorifies. Some have even translated this yakaved as sets a feast for. This is a PL verb, which is sometimes has an intensifying aspect to it. So kind of to really honor or glorify someone. Well, who? The ones who fear Adonai, not the despised, rejected, or the evildoers. And then the next part of this line, this whole verse is tricky. The next part, nishva lahara velo yamir. Literally one swearing an oath. Nishva is to take an oath. And it says, for the evil, and not he will change, or he doesn't change. The Septuagint says, the one who swears an oath to his neighbor and does not reject or set aside, or as the Lexham English translates it, does not break faith. So two ways to translate the second part of this verse as well. If the Hebrew is correct, then it's one taking an oath for the evil is a figure of speech. It's the way you would say one who takes we would say a self-maledictory oath. That is, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. That's if I break my oath, then may harm come upon me. And that's how covenants were made in the ancient world. You would cut an animal in part, you would offer it as a sacrifice, and what you were symbolically saying, sometimes even walking between the pieces of the animal and getting the blood of the animal on you, that was a way of saying, if I break my end of the bargain, if I don't fulfill my oath, may what happened to this animal be what happens to me. So it's a self-maledictory oath. And that could be the sense of what this Hebrew means. One taking an oath for the evil, or an oath for the bad, or an oath for the harm. So someone who does that and doesn't change. In other words, fulfills their oath, even if it does mean harm upon themselves. And that's where the NIV translation comes from, which says, who keeps his oath even when it hurts. But the Septuagint, if that's the correct translation, then it would be one taking an oath to his neighbor and not taking it back or not changing. Like somebody makes a pledge, they make a promise to their neighbor and they fulfill it. Someone who makes a vow and fulfills it. That's an ongoing theme in the Hebrew Bible as something that is required of anyone with integrity. So either way, this verse 4 is just a strange verse. There's a couple of problems translation-wise going on. Check the commentaries for how scholars have proposed, but it's all basically saying the same thing. Someone who protects the integrity of the community and someone who keeps their word no matter what. And then we come to the end, verse 5, Kaspo lo natan beneshek. Literally, his silver, we would say his money, he does not give beneshek, in interest. This is where the NIV uses the word usury, to lend with interest. That's what neshek is. I'm going to give you this, and you're going to give me back more than I gave you. Saying the person who dwells with God, he doesn't do that. And a bribe against the innocent, or upon the innocent, or concerning the innocent, he does not take. So he doesn't lend to get something back in return, and he doesn't take a bribe to pervert justice. One doing these, and these, ele, refers, I would argue, to all of these, everything from verse 2 through verse 5. One doing these, he will not be shaken, or he will not be rattled, or he will not be toppled, le'olam, to eternity. Sometimes it's translated as forever. I actually prefer to translate olam as perpetuity, because it doesn't mean like philosophically forever. It comes from a verb which means hidden, meaning that it's so far in the future or so far in the past that it's hidden. You can't see it. It just means a really, really, really long, far away time. So sometimes it's translated like to forever, to the ages, to eternity. That's why I just went with in perpetuity. I think this captures the sense of what it's saying. One doing these things, he will not be shaken in perpetuity. NIV says he will never be shaken. I think that's fine as well. Now, is this a promise that if you do all these things, nothing bad will ever happen? Is that how you should take he will never be shaken? No, not at all. We've already seen in the Psalms how some of the Psalms are complaints to God because this isn't the case. And the worshiper is crying out, hey, God, you're supposed to be the one who protects me. You're supposed to be my shelter, but yet I'm surrounded by evildoers. So again, these are song lyrics. This is aspirational and desirable. This is not a simple promise. You can't name it and claim it. The Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, Habakkuk, those books are full of examples where this does not seem to be happening, and people cry out to God because of it. However, if it's taken in the general theological sense, as opposed to a promise that every believer can claim, then it starts to make more sense, and it starts to paint a picture of the type of relationship that God desires and the ultimate fate, the ultimate goal, the promise that does stand le'olam, forever, that we can cling to. So Jacobson says it this way: will those who do this really never suffer any ill? Surely the remainder of the Psalter argues against such an interpretation, nor would the psalmist have understood the promise in that sense. Rather, the promise is that those who walk walk in the integrity of God's law found their lives on the most sound bedrock and foundation possible. Suffering and death come for all, but for those who live in God's presence, the shadows of earth become thin. Now, in this short psalm, there's some things that interpreters have noticed that I think are worth pointing out. One, in the ancient world, the answer to these first two questions, who will sojourn in your tent, who will dwell on your holy mountain, for the pagan peoples around Israel, the answer was those who know the correct words to say, those who perform the correct cultic rituals, those who bring the best sacrifices, those who offer even their firstborn in some cases, those who do these certain cultic practices, meet these ritual requirements, have this particular knowledge, those are the people who can enter into the presence of the gods. That's just how it was in the surrounding cultures of Israel. But this is very different because none of these requirements, none of them are ritualistic or cultic in any sense. None of these have to do with sacrifices. None of these have to do with incantations. None of these have to do with saying the right formula or performing the right ritual. None of that. These are all ethical requirements. And so Wilcox says it's a giant step forward from pagan religion to believe that the conditions for coming into the Lord's tent are moral and not ritual. What you are, not the words you recite or the offerings you bring. Wilcox and a few others have argued that if you list out the characteristics of the one who can dwell in the presence of God, there are 10 things. So walking tamim, that's 1. Doing tzedek, 2. Speaking truth in his heart, 3. Not slandering, 4. Not making evil for his neighbor, 5. Not lifting churpah over someone near him, 6. Rejecting the evildoer and honoring the one who fears God, 7. Taking an oath and not changing it, 8. Not lending at interest, 9. Not taking a bribe against the innocent, 10. And so Wilcox goes on and says, the 10 commandments of Psalm 15 are not conditions for people who want to belong, but descriptions of people who do belong. As with the original commandments, first he makes Israel his own, Exodus 20, then explains how his own are to live, the rest of Exodus 20. So he says Psalm 15 outlines the kind of behavior that is appropriate for guests who are staying with God, their friend, especially since it will turn out, such is the lovely ambiguity of the word, that they will actually be staying with him. And that's what Psalm 15 is pointing at, is the idea of sojourning in God's tent, dwelling on God's holy mountain. During this time in Israel's history, it was a temporary thing. But Torah, prophets, and the New Testament in particular looked forward to a day when God would dwell with his people, that he would come and live among them. He would make his home. He would pitch his tent among them, and they would dwell together forever. And because of that, then that's how the final line of this psalm works, is that they will never be shaken because the ultimate destiny is to dwell with God forever. And then one more thing I think definitely worth pointing out, Craig Broyles notes, would-be worshipers are here called to examine how they have lived with their neighbors since their last pilgrimage festival. Remember, this is something to be done when you are entering the tabernacle as part of a worship. And second, these qualifications focus on social or civil, not criminal behavior. Worshipers may not casually assume that they pass the requirements simply because they're not part of society's criminal element. These verses condemn sins that any citizen might commit. They do not point to unusual, heinous crimes, but to matters of daily conversation. He goes on, they transcend what comes under the jurisdiction of the legal system and go to matters of the heart. You know, a lot of this is things that an outward observer couldn't enforce. This is something that the worshiper would have to reflect upon in their own heart and answer the question, who can dwell in God's tent on God's mountain? Can I? And so Broyles continues, thus one's judgment could not be conceded to another. Self-examination under the scrutiny of conscience was required. Rather than attempting to be comprehensive, these qualifications use one's social relationships and especially one's speech as the litmus test to indicate one's true color. They do not allow one to hide behind a cloak of religiosity. And this is not to protect God's holiness. This is to protect the worshiper. The sentiment of the initial double question is not whom should we allow in, but who dares enter in. The purpose is not to safeguard God, the temple, or the sacred community. It's to safeguard the individual and his or her survival. These qualifications are not a checklist, but a warning. So this psalm presents something of a conundrum. No one has completely walked tamim, but yet God knew that, and Torah knew that. There was a way by which people's sins could be forgiven, them repenting, accepting on faith the promise of God's forgiveness, confessing their sin, not trying to hide it, speaking truth in their heart, that they haven't walked tamim, that they haven't always done tzedek. That's part of what it means to walk tamim, to do tzedek. So it's kind of paradoxical, but this psalm forces self-reflection. These 5 verses point forward to the gospel. They point forward to the coming new covenant, whereby God, through his Spirit, would dwell within the hearts of people, would move them to follow his decrees, would take out their heart of stone, replace it with a heart of flesh, sprinkle them with clean water and make them clean. I mean, these are the promises from Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36. And ultimately, that's the only way that one can be someone who dwells on God's holy mountain in his tent. So while this was used as an entrance liturgy during worship times in ancient Israel, most likely, it has implications far beyond that. And once again, in his short little commentary on the Psalms, Derek Kidner, who I definitely recommend this series, by the way, if you're looking for good introductory level comments on the Psalms, Kidner's wonderful. I love how he sums this up. He says, "Indeed, the question of verse 1 spoke of dwelling rather than gaining admission. For the qualities the psalm describes are those that God creates in a man, not those he finds in him." And that's such a great way to put it. If these were the requirements before we could approach the Lord, then everybody's sunk. But instead, this is the type of person that those who dwell in God's presence are to be, and who God's Spirit indwelling in them, tabernacling among them, makes them into. That's the reality that the worshipers, the faithful worshipers in the Old Testament looked forward to and believed in faith that God would bring about. What the Torah calls circumcision of the heart, being transformed from within so that you become a person who lives out the will of God towards everyone all around you. So this is a short, powerful little psalm, only 5 verses, but just there's a lot in here. Hopefully this video encourages you, if you've never really spent much time in the Psalms, to start slowing down and reading a little more carefully, comparing different translations if you're not able to read Hebrew and Greek, which most people aren't, and that's fine. That's why we compare different translations, and you can find so much just by doing that. So that's what we try to model here in this video series in particular. But that's all for now. If you found this helpful, we would love for you to subscribe, tell people about Disciple Dojo, like, comment, share the videos, just all that kind of stuff that helps a YouTube channel grow. But that's all for now. We'll be back with Psalm 16. Stay tuned. In the meantime, as always, keep training.